Africa is a paradox which illustrates and highlights neo-colonialism. Her earth is rich, yet the products that come from above and below her soil continue to enrich not Africans predominantly, but groups and individuals who operate to Africa's impoverishment. With a roughly estimated population of 280 million, about 8% of the world's population, Africa accounts for only 2% of the world's total production. Yet even the present very inadequate surveys of Africa's natural resources show the continent to have immense untapped wealth. We know that iron reserves are put at twice the size of America's and 2/3 of those of the Soviet Union's, on the basis of an estimated 2 billion metric tons. Africa's calculated coal reserves are considered to be enough to last for 300 years. New petroleum fields are being discovered and brought into production all over the continent. Yet, production of primary ores and minerals, considerable as it appears, has touched only the fringes. Africa has more than 40% of the world's potential water power, a greater share than any other continent, yet less than 5% of this volume has been utilized. Even taking into account the vast desert stretches of the Sahara, there is still in Africa more arable land and pasture land than exists in either the United States of America or the Soviet Union. There is even more than in Asia. Our forest areas are twice as great as those in the United States. If Africa's multiple resources were used in her own development, they could place her among the modernized continents of the world. But her resources have been and still are being used for the greater development of overseas interests. And that was written in 1968 by the great Ghanaian leader, great African revolutionary Kwame Nkrumah, who was deposed by British imperialism in the late 1960s and driven into exile. And he was a prolific writer, great thinker, the man who theorized regarding neo-colonialism, which he identified as, of course, a new stage of imperialism where the colonial powers were forced out of direct military occupation, but, as Lenin observed as well, were able to continue to dominate many areas of the world via the sheer strength of their accumulated capital over many, many years of plunder that they had managed to centralize within their own countries. And what Nkrumah identifies there all the way back in the late 1960s is, and to a certain extent is perhaps being brought to an end now, but has been present within the countries we're going to be talking about tonight ever since the formal end of colonization and the disasters that have befallen many of these countries since the French, the British, and of course behind them the United States were able to reimpose their will on them. But as we see from the shifts and changes, not just in recent weeks but in recent years, in places like Guinea, Burkina Faso, Mali, and now of course Niger, you can see that the hold that the European, or more specifically Western European, colonial powers and their American master has over these countries is slowly starting to fracture, which is why the events in Niger are producing such a panicked and desperate response from the French colonialists and their allies. Just a little thing to illustrate the point about what imperialism and neo-colonialism does to countries like Niger. Niger has around 26 million of its inhabitants are having a literacy rate of around about 28%. The infant mortality rate in Niger is the third highest in the world. 80% of the inhabitants of Niger, which supplies 25% of the fuel for all European nuclear power plants, 80% of the inhabitants of that country live without electricity. The life expectancy is around 53 years. So this is a country which has been independent for 60 years, But because of it being, of course, shoved in the CFA franc zone and having successive governments cooed out whenever any of them threatened to go beyond the narrow limitations imposed upon them by French imperialism, they were gotten rid of. Only now, of course, you suddenly see that the Nigerian military, having taken power, are threatening to cut off, and indeed are cutting off, the supply of uranium from the uranium mines in Niger and gold to France. It's also worth noting, if we're talking about neo-colonialism, that France has the fourth largest gold reserves in the world, and yet it doesn't have open, anyway, a single gold mine. Mali, the former French colony, an actual subject of French colonialism till very recently, has about 860 gold mines and produces around 50 tons of gold per year, but doesn't have any gold reserve in its banks. So what has been done to these nations, to places like Mali and Niger, and next door to Niger, in the case of Chad, and in the West African nations as well, is exactly what Kwame Nkrumah was talking about all the way back at the 1960s. These countries are subject to systematic asset stripping by the imperial powers, the looting of their natural resources, the hyper-exploitation of their labor, and the immiseration of the population. The population of Niger, as I've just said, barely lives past the age of 50 on average, has a literacy rate that is lower than this country 100 years ago. And yet, of course, the perpetual question that you would have seen on your television screens when, if you were like me growing up in the 90s and early 2000s, is, oh, why is Africa so poor? Why is Africa so poor? Shouldn't we do something for Africa? And this is particularly sickening if you remember the grotesque antics of a certain Mr. Bob Geldof, the shame of Ireland, as I'm sure our friend in Minsk, Irish Partisan, can confirm, capering about with George W. Bush and Tony Blair and declaring them great friends of Africa. And the farce that went on all the way through the 90s and 2000s about African debt cancellation, which ended up largely not happening, but never looking at the actual reality, which is that the reason why African nations were kept poor and deprived of the fruits of that their natural resources should bring them, and perpetually unstable and subject to coup after coup, is all ultimately because of imperialism. Because imperialism, British imperialism, French imperialism, and now Europe-wide imperialism, personified via the EU, profits from looting these countries, keeping them in poverty, hyper-exploiting their labor, and, of course, forcing them to export only raw resources and to never develop their economies. As the long-term president of Uganda, Yoweri Museveni, observed at the recent Russia-Africa summit, the purpose of European policy and American policy towards all of these countries, the purpose of this is to make sure that the African nations just remain sites of resource extraction. Now, what do I mean by this? When you look at the economies of Africa, and you can look at the smaller countries or the larger countries. You can look at a country like Nigeria, which should be incredibly rich due to its very extensive petroleum industry, but of course isn't, and is perpetually unstable due to various Islamic fundamentalist groups, including Boko Haram and some Nigerian version of ISIS that is popped up there. If you look at the smaller nations like Guinea, like all the other French West African nations over the years, the fact that they were so much, there was so much hope when it comes to its establishment of independence, but the enslavement of those countries by the French under the threat of extreme violence by de Gaulle, of whom more later, has created a system which kept them poor. And part of that, a crucial part of that, is that the system by which these countries are forced to trade with largely Europe, but also the United States, is about only buying the raw resources from them. I talked a little bit about this the other night, but picking up on Museveni's comment, this has gone on for years, and it has never changed through all the bullshit that was talked all the way through the 90s about New Deal for Africa, New Deal for trade, fair terms of trade. Remember fair trade coffee? And all the other sort of consumerist solutions that the Western public was presented with in a way designed to assuage their consciences. Of course, the trade always remained the same, which is that we extract resources under the terms of hyper-exploitation from the African nations. They're taken to Europe, and then they're developed into products that have value added to them by the manufacturing process, by the construction process that the raw materials go through in Europe. And the most famous example of this is, of course, the one that everybody talked about here, or a lot of people talked about here during the Brexit referendum, which is, of course, the example of coffee. And coffee from Kenya, which is, of course, very much present on the shelves of British stores, given that it's a former British colonial possession. And in fact, the British still have military bases there. And if you keep track of the stories that come out from Kenyans regarding how the British military behaves over there, they still behave like an occupying colonial army. And they still treat the locals like absolute shit, including a number of unsolved, horrific sex crimes and murders that has accompanied the British Army wherever it goes, because it's that type of army. It's a colonial occupying army. This is how they all behave. It's the same with the Americans in Japan, in their base in Okinawa. If it's a colonial occupying army, the colonial soldiers have to be completely immune from legal consequences, or largely immune from them, so that if they do commit horrendous crimes, the worst that'll happen to them is that they're shifted out of the country and stuck in a military prison somewhere. The locals largely never see justice. So the way in which this trade is structured, and again drawing on Museveni's comment, the way in which the Europeans bake that into every contract that they sign, is the real story when it comes to the impoverishment of Africa, as all of its most eminent leaders, from people like the murdered Patrice Lumumba to Kwame Nkrumah to Thomas Sankara, they all knew this, which is of course why many of them were deposed and murdered and were replaced with stooges. Now, the interesting thing, the potentially inspirational thing that has gone on in recent years, is that there appears to be a new wave of these free officer movements that have emerged out of largely West Africa. So you had one a few years ago in Guinea, of course, and then this was an interesting one in many respects because, of course, it brought to power a man who had been formerly a French legionnaire. He's a member of the French Foreign Legion. This guy called Mamadi Doumbouya, who ultimately became president. And he's a man who was trained in the French military, was an officer in the French Foreign Legion, and ultimately then comes to power and leads an anti-French colonialism movement in the military. And this happens quite a lot. It happens more than you would think, that many of the characters who led revolts against French colonialism, British colonialism, US imperialism, a lot of them have been through the military training schemes that the colonial power runs. Like the big thing, of course, to the British in India was that even though it was largely, except for a bit towards the end, it was largely a British officer corps that was in command of this, they depended upon Indian colonial troops to keep control of India. And that's why they fostered so many divisions between the different religious groups in India when it was colonized. But when they realized that the game was up was when the Indian military revolted against them in, I think it was 1946, when the British attempted to put on trial a group of men who had been part of Subhash Chandra Bose's Indian National Army. And that was a group led by Chandra Bose, who actually fought with the Japanese against British colonialism, because from their point of view, and it's quite a legitimate point of view, the main enemy was British colonialism. And if fighting with the Japanese meant the destruction of British colonialism, then that was a bargain they were prepared to make. And who can say that from their perspective that was wrong? The upshot of this attempt to put members of the Indian National Army on trial, though, caused a massive mutiny in the Indian Navy, which was, again, most of the rank and file of that Navy and Air Force and Army in India, particularly for the Air Force. It was the ground crew and support men. There was a huge naval mutiny, and Indian Army units rebelled as well. And that panicked the British, finally, into doing their deal and scuttling out of there, whilst doing partition on the way out. And it was that revolt of men that they'd trained and armed which convinced them that they had no chance of hanging on there. So it's often the case that the men that the imperialists take and train and arm actually come to have more contempt for the system than those who have been left almost completely untouched by it. And the same was true even of a man like Gaddafi, who said that he developed his more revolutionary opinions after he was taken to a training course in the period of the Libyan monarchy. And he was taken to a training course in one of the British military establishments and got to know the British officer corps up close and personal, and that radicalized him. He said that they were all a bunch of horrendous, backward racists, which I can easily believe. So it should be no surprise that a lot of these men who've been through French, British, and American training courses end up turning against the people who trained them, because often seeing the system right up close and from the inside can really increase your contempt for it. So this was what happened in Guinea. It was an anti-French coup that took place 2 years ago. And then you get the events in Mali and then Burkina Faso, where, of course, President Traoré comes to power. And there's some fascinating details about what's been done there, because it's very much directly in the tradition of Thomas Sankara, who, of course, died in 1987 in a coup instigated by the French and carried out by the local hitman, Blaise Compaoré. But the interesting thing about Traoré, one of many interesting things, is the guy's only 34 years old, but he appointed as the head of government there a guy called Kielemdi Tambela. And Tambela was actually a guy who made his name as a much younger man in the days of the Sankara administration. And Tambela had been a lawyer and an author, and he'd been the guy who studied and written the book on the Thomas Sankara revolutionary process. And the book's called Thomas Sankara and the Revolution in Thomas Sankara and the Revolution in Burkina Faso, an experience of self-centered development. And he was involved in the committees to defend the revolution back in the 80s. And now Traoré brought him back essentially to run the government. And he's been the man who's been behind a lot of the moves that Burkinabe government has made to actually secure genuine independence from France. And he was the one who was doing the negotiating with the French about getting the exit of the French forces from Burkina Faso, which they eventually secured. So this is a new, what apparently seems to be a new movement spreading across French or former French West Africa. And as we go to talk about that, what I'm going to do is I'm going to pull up a map just to show you a couple of things to illustrate a point. So here is the map of West Africa, and I wanted just to draw your attention to that. You can see I've been talking about Guinea, which you can see there on the left-hand side, which is where the first of these coups that we talked about, which brought a radical military regime to power. And then you can see Burkina Faso there in the middle, and you can see Mali directly above it, and of course Niger just to the right of that. And all of these, most of these countries you can see listed there, other than like Nigeria and some of the smaller ones there, these were mainly French colonial possessions. And what the French are, and of course the whole European Union, are absolutely terrified of, is the idea that the whole of the area that is known as the Sahel is going to fall under the influence of radical nationalistic movements. So I'm going to call up another map now which shows you the area identified as the Sahel. So you can see there the orange strip across the middle top to middle part of Africa. It's this long strip all the way across the continent, just below the North African, more Arab nations, which takes in a lot of these countries that we're going to be talking about. So you can see there it runs through Mauritania, Mali, Niger, Chad, Sudan, which through various machinations of imperialism was cut in two a few years ago, and over there onto the east coast, near Ethiopia and Eritrea. And this is an area that was selected several years ago by none other than Tony Blair himself as an area that was going to be absolutely crucial for what he termed security in the near future. And this was a Blair speech from, I believe it was late 2021, and it was rather blunt in its messaging because he was giving it to an insider crowd. And he was talking about how the Sahel, which is the region you've just seen there, was going to be crucial for controlling large areas of trade. So, for instance, let's look at what they've got there, which is, as we've already covered, large deposits of uranium, which the Europeans in particular need to be able to cheaply run their nuclear power facilities when they're already in the middle of an energy price crisis. Large deposits of gold. Of course, further south, you've got a large oil trade. As the quote from Nkrumah, which we started the program with, reveals, you've actually got an awful lot of resources all the way across Africa, including, as he says, very significant water resources, which are, of course, not used properly due to the fact that all those countries you've just seen in West Africa and the Sahel, despite all of that economic potential, have remained in a state of submission and underdevelopment, because that is what the Europeans and the Americans have dictated that they should have. So this clown who was overthrown recently in Niger, the great democratically elected president, it just shows you how valueless that is. This Mohamed Bazoum was a guy who was just going to keep Niger in that submission. That's why he's been defended by the puppet regimes in ECOWAS, which stands for Economic Community of West African States. And if you look at who's members of that, it's various different former, largely French, but also British and Portuguese colonial possessions. And of course, you see that all the countries who have tried to break free of French colonial control have all been suspended from the organization. And now ECOWAS is threatening military intervention in Niger, because Macron has got on his box, stood up and said, this far and no further. But of course, what's happening is an unpinning of this French colonial system that's dominated West Africa, because suddenly Mali, Burkina Faso and Guinea have all said that they'll stand with and defend Niger, as has Algeria, the vast neighbouring country to the north. And that puts a different complexion on it, because the French won't want to get involved in a shooting war in Niger themselves. They'd far rather try and strong-arm some countries from West Africa to do it for them, but I don't think they'll be willing to do it. And what are they going to? The British going to try and send the Nigerians in, who it's such a corrupt and useless government in Nigeria that they can't even suppress the ragtag jihadist groups that are being run there. Or perhaps those jihadist groups are being helped by somebody from the outside. Interesting point to consider further. But it is much less likely than it appears that they will actually be able to do a military intervention. The French may try, or the Americans even may try, some kind of bombing campaign to try and make the military leaders capitulate. But having seen that the the officers' movements in Guinea and Burkina Faso and Mali have got as far as they have, they may well be strengthened in their resolve to continue. And here we get to the question of how a a revolutionary nationalist government, because I think that's the best way to describe it, can actually survive when faced with hostile foreign powers. And the most, of course, proficient way to actually not only survive but build something is to, of course, tap into the energy of the masses. And as you can see from the ferocious response from the Nigerian masses, attacking and destroying the property of the despised politicians who've been deposed now, and of course besieging the French embassy, is that the masses are never as stupid and backward as the colonialists and their compradors want everybody to think. They may not be, fully up to speed with Marxist-Leninism, but they don't need to be to know who's stiffed them and who's been stiffing them for decades. They might not understand completely the way forward, but they know who their enemies are. And if the military regime that's come in is able to turn to them and say, we need to resist as a whole nation against this attempt to essentially put us back under colonial control, judging from the outside, from what I can see, it certainly seems like such an appeal would receive an enthusiastic response. And as we were talking about last night, now these countries have options that didn't perhaps exist even as little ago as 10 years ago. They have the option to do a negotiation with the Russians, who I'm sure would delight in twisting the knife into Macron, or, of course, the Chinese, who are happy to deal with anybody and would probably laugh at the Europeans' discomfort. So the options are there for these countries now to actually trade with other nations. And they've been getting ripped off for the supply of uranium and gold and other precious resources that are mined out of the ground there and taken to Europe for many, many years. So there is a huge opportunity here for all of the West African nations to undergo a new freedom movement. And that should be something that any communist in the Western countries welcomes, because it will be a further intensification of the crisis that certainly not just French capitalism is facing, but all of capitalism in Europe is facing. Let's remind ourselves of how hysterical these things have got over the last 24 hours. We've had the chief gardener, Joseph Borrell, babbling on about how it's unacceptable and we need to take action now to stop this grotesque violation of democracy. And bear in mind, that's the same Joseph Borrell who turned to Lavrov, the Russian foreign minister, apparently, and said, don't set foot in the Sahel is ours, which brings us back to that comment made by the arch-imperialist Tony Blair. That's what he was saying in that speech he made back in 2021, that there would be a struggle over the possession of the Sahel region. Of course, Blair would not have considered for a moment that the inhabitants might rebel. He's just thinking purely in terms of great power competition. But as the imperialist star starts to wane, the opportunities for these nations become greater, and the people within these nations can see that a rebellion can succeed, which is what is happening now. So the chief gardener, Joseph Borrell, started babbling about the need to restore democracy. He means the need to restore their puppet ruler. You got Ursula von der Leyen threatening the people of Niger in a way which a Nazi grandfather would have been proud of. And you get all the European politicians lining up and screaming about it, because they suddenly realize that if the Nigerians can successfully hold on, if they can successfully push this this nationalist movement further, then the European countries are facing a severe crisis, to add further to their energy crisis, to add also further problems, because if this succeeds, then you might start to see other countries follow suit. You might start to see the regimes in places like Chad start to shake. The other regimes that are still pro-French imperialism run by compradors in West Africa might start to look incredibly unstable. And if this whole thing just falls in on itself, then that's going to have a big impact on all of European capitalism, because that's going to have a negative impact on the French and the Germans, both of whom have engaged in acts of neo-colonialism in West Africa since the 1960s. This was tracked, by the way, in an old paper done by the Soviet Union back in the 1960s, when Soviet researchers were assigned to look into how neo-colonialism operated in Africa, and they were doing regular reports on it, which some of which are translated into English. I will try and dig one out and post it in the Telegram group. Until the 1980s, when of course Gorbachev sold out to the West and declared that, well, we recognize Africa as a British and French zone of interest. Again, if I believed in hell, I would believe that Gorbachev would be in it. But point is that West Germany, when it was just the Federal Republic of Germany, was involved with this neo-colonial process. In West Africa and South and Central Africa, the Federal Republic of Germany, as it was then, was involved in imposing these negative terms of trade, in hyper-exploiting the natural resources and labor of the African nations, as much as the French and the British were. So West Germany, now Germany, is just as much up to its neck in neo-colonialism as the French and the British and, of course, the Americans and the Belgians have been. So there's no German get out on this one. And, of course, you want to go back to the old days of German imperialism in Africa. The people of Namibia might have something to say about their legacy, given that they wiped out around about 1 million people in Namibia when it was German Southwest Africa prior to World War I. So this is a very interesting development, and if you look at the way in which this has been responded to, suddenly all these people who were all taking the knee a few years ago and were all mouthing the corporate phrase Black Lives Matter, well, you look at their actual record and you can see just how much that the lives of the black Africans matter to them in places like Niger, where they're condemned to death by age 53, where most of them are illiterate, where there's record numbers of newborns dying of preventable diseases, where the nations just aren't developed for many, many years, where the only development they ever saw was when they had partnerships with the old Soviet Union or when they have some kind of partnership with the Chinese today. That's the reality of Europe and Britain and the United States in Africa. It's just endless exploitation, endless immiseration, endless extraction of resources and wealth from these countries. And now when it's all starting to go wrong and they're facing a new liberation struggle, they're all panicking and desperately trying to intimidate the African nations into staying in line. I don't think it's going to work this time. I really don't. So, pausing now to catch up with the chat. So, hello to the following people. Hello, Red Star Betty, Kai, Irish Partisan, Comrade in Minsk, James Graham. Hello to Morgan. Hello to CJ. Hello to Beiju from Barnet. How you doing out there? Irish Partisan says, Bob Geldof and Bono, the gruesome twosome. Ireland's shame. Bono completed the shame by playing a gig for Zelensky in a tube station in Kiev. Hello to Ash out in Melbourne. Hello to HWO. Remember the other day you were saying about the social contract in France changing. They must be panicking even more now. Energy prices will rocket. Yes, if the new government in Niger holds and the banning of exports of uranium to France holds, well, the government of Macron is going to be in even more serious trouble. If they don't manage to depose this government, then they'll have to renegotiate with them because they're not going to get that supply of uranium quickly from anywhere else in the world. And of course, now a whole section of the world uranium market is not selling at the moment, then the prices are going to go up anyway. So the French are in trouble, as is the rest of Europe, because as I said, it's not just the French nuclear power stations that have been going to be affected by this, it's all of the European nuclear power stations, such as those that still exist. Hello to Peter, who can unexpectedly come along tonight. Good to see you. Hello to Roddy. Beiju says, the West's prosperity is intricately linked to its imperial relationship with the world and especially Africa. Yep, that's exactly right, and that's why they are panicking at the moment. Yes, I thought you'd appreciate the point about BLM. Hello to Sneaks. Kai asks, what sort of tricks can we expect the Western intelligence agencies to get up to in order to protect capitalist interests in West Africa? Well, we can expect more of what they've done in the past. They can try coups. They can try, the problem that you have with like free officer movements, and this has been a historic problem, is that even though a lot of these can be very powerful, like the Nasserist movement and the officer movement that helped create the Syrian Ba'ath Party and the Iraqi Ba'ath Party, they tend to be a little unstable because they do come from often quite narrow layers of the population. Now, in the case of someone like Sankara, he was, of course, another guy who'd come through the French old military system. But he tried to secure the revolution by having these committees in defense of the revolution, by involving the masses. And that, of course, made the process a little bit stronger, but they still couldn't survive his death and the brutal coup that took place in 87. So one of the things they'll immediately look to is try and find themselves a Blaise Compaoré, the guy who killed Thomas Sankara. And they'll do this in various different ways. The crudest way, which is, of course, to offer a giant bag of cash to anybody who'll shoot and kill any of the military leaders in Niger or anywhere else who've taken power and established a radical nationalist regime there. So there's that way. There's just bribing somebody to kill them or depose them. Then there's in terms of color revolutions, it's less likely they'd be able to do that kind of thing in some of the African nations. This was a big thing in Europe and in Asia. In Africa, they're more fond of the direct brute force approach. And of course, there is the small prospect, but it still is a prospect of them trying some kind of direct military intervention. Again, like if the Nigerian or other countries' armies are united and able to put up resistance, and the masses are behind them, then that's incredibly difficult to do. It's much more difficult to do that than it is to depose some weak government run by a clique. The stronger the connection with the masses is, the more difficult it is to actually depose a government. And that's something that I would hope that the military men in Niger have that in mind, because there's clearly strength of feeling amongst the Nigerian masses for the stand that they're taking against the French. So hopefully that strengthens the resolve of that government. And of course, the more they can directly involve the masses in a revolutionary process, the stronger that will be. Let's hope so. Is Ibrahim Traoré a socialist? He seems to be heavily influenced by the thoughts of Thomas Sankara. I would say that the best way I could think of to describe him at this stage, and I don't know enough about him as yet, PM. The more I will find out, the more I will say about this. Certainly, I would say he's a Pan-Africanist. Certainly, a lot of these guys who are coming to power in places like Mali, Burkina Faso, Guinea, Niger, they are seemingly very influenced by the Pan-Africanist tradition, some more influenced by the Pan-African socialist tradition than others. That's why I would recommend everybody to go away and read as much as you can of people like Kwame Nkrumah, who's one of the big theorists and leaders of the first wave of post-independence Pan-Africanism, because one of the things that the Burkinabes and the Malians are thinking of and wanting to promote is this idea of bringing together their states under a new unitary state. And this was apparently tried, or it was starting to be developed in the late 50s, before, of course, the leaders who proposed this were cooed out. And, of course, it's with the great dream of a lot of Pan-African socialists was to unite the countries as far as they could within Africa, beyond the what are correctly regarded as the somewhat false borders drawn by colonialism, and that Africa, if united, and as Kwame Nkrumah would put it, or did put it, or united on a socialist basis, would be a gigantic economic superpower, perhaps outstripping in potential even somewhere as dynamic as China now. As Nkrumah says, the economic, the resource potential, the human potential for the African peoples is all there. It's just the fact that they have been held back by being crippled by imperialism and a neo-colonialism for many, many years. But the potential is all there. You look at a nation like Nigeria and the rapid growth of its population, all the resources that it has. You look at the Congolese, the DRC, and even with the horrors that they've been through, the huge economic potential of that country and the huge role that it could play in the development of the whole region is still criminally underused because of the way in which these nations have been exploited and kept in a state of underdevelopment. So it's not a surprise that the Pan-African socialist tradition does still live, which I think is what Traore represents. And I hope it strengthens, because it would be an enormous step forward for the liberation of some of the most oppressed people in the world if this was to spread across many, many African nations, which I hope it does. But I hope also that as part of this revolutionary process that they can have the process of the communist parties in these countries being either strengthened or rebuilt, because even though these are countries now being led by revolutionary nationalists who've come out of the officer corps of the army and are playing a progressive role, only with a strengthened communist party can the revolution be pushed forward, I would say, where you need more of the masses involved, you need more of the masses mobilized, and for that I think you need a strong communist party in all of these countries to make sure that that process carries on, in alliance with the revolutionary nationalist and Pan-Africanist forces who are pushing it forward so far. But I would hope that communist parties are built there pretty quickly. So Peter says, the collapse of the USSR was a catastrophe for colonized people. Russia and China offer them some fellowship, while Western imperialists only offer economic punishment, poverty, and an early grave. Very true. Now, it's not just the collapse of the USSR. I think it was the final years under Gorbachev were just nothing but outright treachery and openly selling out to imperialism, powered by the worst comprador elements that emerged in the USSR. Now, if we get back into that, again, we'll be here for 2 hours talking about that. But if you look at the progressive role the USSR was playing, even during the downward years of sort of capitalist restoration, or attempted capitalist restoration under Khrushchev, and to a certain extent Brezhnev, and the early 80s as well, Andropov and Chernenko era, even then they were continuing to play a progressive role. It was only after around about 87 when Gorbachev is powerful enough just to pull the plug and openly sell out everything. And then the whole thing just collapsed. And yeah, Peter's completely correct. Without that center of global liberation being present, the liberation movements in Africa suffered a huge setback, which they weren't able to recover from until fairly recently. So this is, again, another tragedy of the Soviet collapse. And interestingly enough, that Putin, the lifelong almost, certainly career-long anti-communist, was spending so much time in the recent Russia-Africa summit dwelling upon the legacy of the Soviet Union in Africa, talking about all the facilities and industry that the Soviet Union built up, which of course is true, and the Soviet presence helped to develop many countries, including places like Ghana, and to give them an economic start which they could not have got without the legacy of the Bolshevik Revolution, without the Soviet Union being there and being able to assist them. And it's amusing to see that Putin's now leaning into all of that in terms of claiming the legacy, renaming one of the universities in Moscow, I believe, renaming it after Patrice Lumumba when the Yeltsin period had seen all that dropped, and having to, when adapting to this new global situation, having to lean into that Soviet legacy is a very interesting development, if you've been observing the way that Putin has moved from being a much more straight out-and-out anti-communist in his early years to a much more nuanced position now. So, Beju says, if Africa and Global South win sovereignty, will this lead to significant fall in living standards in the West? It will be something that the ruling class in France, Britain, Germany, all these places, tries to pass on to us in order to preserve themselves. But then it is down to us to develop resistance to that, to let the working class know in all of these countries, including our own, why it is that our living standards are collapsing, especially if the imperialists try and go on a warpath. We have to be able to say the reason why our wages are restricted, why we're losing all the concessions that were ever made to us, is because of this utterly parasitic system that only exports capital and creates immiseration, both overseas and now increasing immiseration, alienation, atomization, and collapse in our own home nations as well. I mean, you've all seen, I'm sure, the various sort of meme type tweets going around of those clips of various different American cities filled with people who are high on meth and in various states of disrepair. You can go around any British city these days, you can see somebody huddled in the doorway without any shoes on, covered in dirt. These are nations that are in a state of decay, where you have tiny islands of wealth and increasing areas of people who are in full-time work and are still in poverty. And that's the reality that's only going to grow as time goes on. And the key thing that we have to do is to be able to start organizing those masses who are going to be increasingly thrust into poverty and organizing them to challenge against the system, which will, of course, as has been discussed a lot recently, involve also having to push past the bureaucratic resistance of the trade union leadership and of course, the government that could be potentially headed by the failed and corrupted and useless remnants of the social democracy in Britain and other places as well. Right. Movie Maker Joe says Western citizens will have to overthrow the degenerate governance structures. And Movie Maker Joe is correct. AR says, could this be the canary in the gold mine that officially sparked World War III? I don't think so. I think that if bigger conflagrations are going to happen, they're going to happen in the East. They're going to happen if the Americans finally find a way to secure some sort of war against China. But this is a new period of imperialist decline and crisis, which means that there's going to be these crises for imperialism are going to start erupting everywhere. They may succeed in repressing them here and there, but their weakness has now been seen by the great masses in the African nations and elsewhere. And now that that process has started, it cannot be reversed. Just like they cannot really reverse the legacy of the October Revolution. They can't. That dealt a fatal blow to imperialism, which even with the betrayals of Khrushchev and Gorbachev and the collapse of the USSR and the taking of the capitalist road by China, that legacy could never be extinguished. They couldn't never go back to the direct rule of the colonial period. Even though the Americans tried in places like Iraq, it was impossible to reimpose that. So even with everything that's gone on over the last 30 years, their legacy is still strong enough to inspire people and to make direct colonialism impossible, and to, of course, plunge imperialism into a very long-term crisis, of which this is just the current phase. This is just the current iteration. Pablo says, one strong communist party, not half a dozen weak ones fighting amongst themselves, and Pablo makes a very good point. The Soviets and Cubans saved our bacon in Angola, says AR. Well, the Cuban role, especially in Angola and Namibia, was heroic because they organized and helped the Angolans and the Southwest African People's Liberation Movement in what's now Namibia, because, of course, that was what I mentioned earlier. Namibia was German Southwest Africa. Then it became part of apartheid South Africa, and it was a Cuban army which helped the Namibians defeat the apartheid army, which was a huge blow to the prestige of the apartheid system and the idea of the invincible white armies, as was, by the way, the defeat of the racist regime of Ian Smith in old Rhodesia, then turned Zimbabwe, by the liberation movement led by Robert Mugabe. So this is a long evolving story, but yes, the Cuban role was crucial and a heroic example of internationalism in action in what happened in their actions in Angola and Namibia. Movie Maker Joe says, it's not up to Africa to moderate the path for Europeans who have no natural resources Negotiation on the basis of sincerity is up to its citizens. Well, I'd say once we should overthrow the degenerating monopoly capitalists that dominate Britain, France, and all of Europe, and then negotiate in terms of trade what we need on the basis of equal nations, not on the basis of the brutal exploitation and extraction anymore. But as I was saying last night, we also will be given the opportunity to redevelop our own countries on the basis of the maximization of our own resources, which will put more people to work in productive labor again, which will get us away from being a bullshit-based economy based on the extraction of wealth from elsewhere. And as part of that, we deal with the nations of Africa and other places as really people to people, and on equal terms of trade, where we do need to trade. And that'll be a great day when that happens, because finally we'll be entering into a stable and equal system of exchange based on an exchange between hopefully socialist countries. So, Makumi says, how do we fight against this supra-constitutional bodies like the Sahel Alliance or the East African Community? The masses cannot see the danger as they have small benefits at the start. It's an interesting one, because a lot of these things like ECOWAS and other organizations, these are purely controlled by imperialism. This is what I come back to, this idea that like the masses in these countries like Niger, of course, know that they're being stiffed and know that their long-term enemy is the French, but often the role of the supranational bodies is a little bit mystified to them. But I think they could grasp it pretty quickly when faced with it. If the African communists and nationalists and Pan-Africanists are able to talk to the masses, appeal to them, explain what the nature of all these bodies are, not just the supranational ones that are in Africa, but the bigger ones, such as, well, what is the role of the IMF? I bet the masses could understand that pretty quickly. Or the World Bank, or the World Trade Organization, or the World Health Organization, come to think of it, given that that's now just a corporate body designed to sell the products of Western pharmaceutical companies and often experiment on the peoples of Africa for the purposes of profit. That's what Bill Gates has been doing for years. So the role of the supranational bodies does need to be politically explained clearly to the masses who are involved in the struggle. But I think they would grasp it pretty quickly. But that just elevates the question around political education, which is, of course, something that Sankara did place a lot of value on, because he understood, ultimately he wasn't able to complete this process, but he understood that only the education of the masses, the political education and their mass involvement in the revolution was going to be the thing that preserved it. And this is shown again by the example of, again, the most prominent being the DPRK, Democratic People's Republic of Korea, or Nicaragua and the mass movements that support the Sandinista revolution there, the mass involvement of the working class and the peasants in the defense of the Bolivarian revolution in Venezuela, the mass mobilization of the workers of Cuba in defense of the revolution. So all of this shows you the way in which things will need to go if the current movements in West Africa are to succeed and spread. The role of the masses and the political education of the masses and their involvement in the defense of a revolutionary process, this is all absolutely crucial for these processes going forward. I'm sure that certainly in Burkina Faso and perhaps in Mali, they are fully aware of this. Certainly in the Burkinabe seem to be fully aware of this. So there's some exchange on reading suggestions there, all very good. AR says their father served in the MPLA, which was trained in the Soviet Union and also in Cuba. He says the problem today is the comprador. Well, salute to your father, AR, and he's absolutely right. I'm not sure exactly what the situation is in Angola at the moment, but certainly it seems that there was a comprador turn, of course, in many of the African nations after the collapse of the Soviet Union, because the only game left in town was the Western imperialists for quite a long period of time. But again, this is the changing nature of the times we live in, that now the wheel is turning again, the wheel of history, and it's turning away from the imperialists again. Ash says, I remember you recommended a Walter Rodney book on the development of Africa. Have you read his book, 1917, A View from the Third World? It's on the list. I haven't actually got through it yet, but it may be something that we would benefit from doing a reading group on in the near future. If Makumi says, if NATO puts boots on the ground in Niger, which seems probable, what would be the way forward for communists in this era of naked aggression by a weakening empire? I mean, they could put men into Niger. That's not beyond them. There is a question of how much of actual military material they'd have to fight with, given how much of it they've dumped into Ukraine. Would it be... And it depends if they were resisted or not. I don't think, again, I'm guessing here, if the Nigerians are able to put forward a strong opposition and they've got support from the Burkinabes, the Malians, the Guineans, the Algerians, and that remains solid, I don't think that the French are going to fancy that, or the Germans, or even the Americans are going to fancy having that kind of shooting match. Again, whether this depends upon whether this support front they've got at the moment remains solid or not. Their ideal scenario, I would think, the NATO countries, would be to quickly eliminate the new Nigerian government and be able to do it without too much loss of life on their part. Now, would they be able to do that? Well, I think that 10 years ago they might have been able to do that. Certainly the French were. They're less able to now, partly because of how much they've sunk into Ukraine, which is another reason why the victory of the Russians is going to be a good thing for the developments here. Now, in terms of your question, what would we do about it if say the British and the French and the Germans try to do some expeditionary force stuff in Niger? Well, we've got to do whatever we can, however we can, to try and mobilize opinion around that. Now, that won't be easy, given that the events in Niger will be relentlessly lied about, if they're portrayed on the news at all. I haven't actually checked the bourgeois press other than online today. I don't know what the BBC is saying about it. So the question of it is the way in which we can do something about it. Certainly we should be talking to people about it. Certainly if there's exiled communities that support the process that's going on in Niger right now, we should look to work with them. We should make the working class aware of what is going on in a place like Niger and why it's happening and why it's in our interests to oppose these things, because they'll be flooded with propaganda about stability, democracy, evil military dictators. So we need to, however we can, counteract that. Now, in the moment, it's going to be in a small way, but we have to try in whatever way we can, and to talk about why it's in ultimately our interests to see the nations of Africa develop properly, to fully realize their economic potential, and for us to be able to have an actual equitable relationship between, hopefully, socialist countries. And that's something that we should be talking to the working class about. I mean, at the moment, we're just not the size that would be able to do some kind of mass intervention on that basis, but we should be prepared to talk to as many people we can about it. If the British try some kind of colonial expeditionary force, then, I mean, we should be raising the debate in the trade union movement, because all that will happen there, if it's discussed at all, is like some pro-imperialist measure will get passed at some union conference, like it's being done over Ukraine at the moment. So we should be putting forward for debate wherever we can anti-imperialist motions in trade unions, raising the issue, demanding or raising the demand that the union movement condemn active military interventions or proxy wars that are waged against Niger or anywhere else in Africa that is waging some kind of freedom struggle. And again, this is limited in terms of what we can do at the moment, but we must be trying to raise consciousness about this wherever we can, and taking a very clear line that we support Niger, Burkina Faso, Mali, and Guinea, and any other country that is trying to break free from this stranglehold, the neo-colonial stranglehold that they have been held in for many, many decades, and we support them against the attempts of the puppet regimes in West Africa or the NATO states to reimpose control over them. And it is in the interest of the working class that these nations develop, and we are able to actually build a real and equitable trading relationship with them. And again, big job, but again, we have to start doing these things. It can't be ignored. It can't be put on the back burner. It can't be said it's not a priority. It's got to be a priority to carry out a political education campaign as to what is actually going on there, and why their struggle for true sovereignty and true independence must be supported. So, bourgeois media promoting ECOWAS. I'm not surprised, Yuan, because that would be the move that I would expect. I think that if they're going to try anything, they're going to try and pressure ECOWAS into a military intervention first. I don't think the French will want to get dirty themselves in this. And I think that perhaps there's just about enough people with just about enough brains in the French government to know that if it's a direct French intervention, i.e. French tanks rolling through the streets, then it's going to look bad. They would much rather get the African compradors to do it for them. But if they're not going to cut the mustard, then I wouldn't rule out them doing something, particularly with regard to bombing campaigns or something like that. Anything they do in that regard must be exposed and opposed, though, wherever we can. So this has been going for just over an hour or so now. What I'll say just in conclusion is that this represents an incredibly interesting new development, or a renewed development, shall we say, of a freedom struggle that was essentially put on hold or reversed for many, many years. I mean, if you think just of the number of horrific reversals that the freedom struggle in the African nations has suffered over the last 30 years, to see it go forward again should be an inspiration for all of us. I would recommend that everybody read the books of Walter Rodney, especially on how Europe underdeveloped Africa, but also the works of Nkrumah as well, which the book I quoted from at the beginning is called Neocolonialism, the Last Stage of Imperialism. He also wrote a whole lot of other things, particularly when he was in exile in his later life after the Brits and the Americans deposed him. Okay, we've got another question. Movie Maker Joe. Do you think that Macron can launch strikes on Niger? Will the EU degenerates be able to financially and physically support this? I would say that if they can't get ECOWAS to act as their proxy, they may want to do that. But then again, I mean, they have been drained. Certainly, the German military has been stripped. The French military hasn't been stripped quite as much, but it's severely depleted and damaged by the long war in Ukraine, and also their unsuccessful wars in Mali and places like that. So it's an interesting one. This is a case where the Russian NATO war in Ukraine is going to limit what they can do, and this might be one of the reasons. I think it is one of the reasons why this is breaking out now, as it has done. Makumi says, breaking. Guinea, Burkina Faso, Mali and Algeria have expressed that they would declare war on any Western or ECOWAS invasion of Niger. Your comments, the crack in the imperial shell. Well, if it's the case that that holds, then that is a hugely positive development, because it would mean, I mean, certainly the military forces of a place like Algeria, which has they've carried out joint training with the Russians recently, I believe. If those countries all stand with Niger, then even the compradors in West Africa aren't going to want to do it. And it's going to be really difficult for the French to do it. And if you think that those riots in France were bad recently, or how is it going to look in France if the French have to go into a shooting war with the Algerians again in Africa? That's something that Macron's not going to want to slice off, is he? So if those stand firm with this, then that is a hugely positive development. I will be writing about this very soon. So keep track of this. I will revisit it tomorrow if necessary. Appropriately enough, going to be looking at the Mao essay on the correct handling of contradictions amongst the people very soon, and that will take us to into the final part of the first phase of the political education project we've started to run here, and we're going to be moving into announcing the second phase of reading coming up when I finalize that. So again, keep an eye on West Africa, and I will conclude by saying this: victory to the revolutionaries of Niger, death to French colonialism and its rotten master, American imperialism. And while we're at it, may the British Empire finally be cast into the pits of hell. Victory to all the African nations, and victory to the Pan-African socialist struggle. Thank you for tuning in. I'll be back with you again tomorrow.